The wind tore through the Arizona plains like a living thing, carrying sand and the faint scent of thunder. The wagon's front wheel hit a rut and snapped with a sharp crack, pitching Clara Weston into the red dust. Her traveling trunk burst open beside her, scattering corsets, letters, and lace across the barren earth like lost confessions under God's relentless sun. For a long moment, she didn't move. The heat pressed down on her, heavy and cruel. Her mouth tasted of copper and fear. When she finally lifted her head, she saw nothing but endless desert, the kind of place that swallowed both men and dreams without apology. The two men she'd paid to take her to the town of Red Hollow were already specks on the horizon. They had taken her coins, her food, and the last of her faith and decency. Clara rose shakily, clutching the torn fabric of her dress. The Arizona sun turned her fair skin crimson. Sweat mixed with tears, and for the first time in her 29 years, she whispered aloud what she'd always feared to admit. "I don't know how to save myself." She'd come from Philadelphia, a city of iron gates, silk gloves, and whispered reputations. After her father's ruinous debts and her mother's quiet death, Clara had been left with one desperate choice: to answer an advertisement for a teacher in the Western Territories. A new life, she'd told herself. A clean slate. Freedom. Now that promise lay in the dust with her belongings. She began gathering what she could, folding each garment with trembling fingers, as if order might tame the rising panic. But the silence pressed in until it felt like a weight on her chest. There was no shade, no road markers, no sound but the wind. Then, hoofbeats, slow, heavy, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Clara turned. A figure emerged from the shimmering heat, enormous atop a massive dark horse. For a fleeting second, she thought the desert had conjured him from myth. The rider dismounted with effortless grace. He stood so tall she had to tilt her chin to meet his gaze. Broad shoulders, dust-streaked skin, a jaw shadowed by days of travel. But it was his eyes, pale gray, sharp as thunderclouds, that rooted her in place. He removed his hat, and his deep, rasping voice cut through the wind. "You look like you've been through hell, ma'am." "I've been abandoned," Clara managed. "They left me here." The stranger's expression darkened. "Name's Elias Ward," he said. "I saw your wagon from the ridge. You're lucky I came by." Clara tried to steady her breath. Everything about him radiated strength, unsettling, raw strength. He could have been carved from the same red stone that surrounded them. Yet, there was something careful in the way he looked at her, as though aware of how easily his size might frighten her. He extended one massive calloused hand. "Let me help you up." Clara hesitated. Her father's warnings echoed in her mind. Men in the frontier were beasts, he'd said, brutes who respected neither law nor virtue. But the ground burned her knees, and the horizon offered no mercy. She placed her small, dusty hand in his. His palm was warm, rough, alive. He lifted her effortlessly, as if she weighed nothing at all. "You're trembling," Elias noted, his voice softening. "You need water." "I'll manage," she lied. He looked toward her shattered wagon. "That wheel's done for. You won't make it a mile. My camp's close. A creek, some shade. You can rest there till we figure something better." Pride warred with fear inside her, but the choice was simple. Trust this stranger, or die in the desert. "Thank you," she whispered. Elias nodded once, then lifted her trunk as if it were a feather. "You ride, I'll walk." "I can walk," Clara insisted weakly. Elias's gaze flicked to her blistered feet and sunburnt arms. "You'll ride?" His tone brooked no argument. When her knees buckled, he caught her before she hit the ground. The sudden closeness made her breath hitch. She could smell leather, pine, and the faint sweetness of tobacco clinging to him. He looked down at her with an unreadable expression, half concern, half something deeper. "Easy now," he said, his voice low, almost tender. "You're safe." He lifted her into the saddle, one hand steady at her waist, then took the reins and began to lead the horse westward. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in bruised shades of gold and crimson. Clara watched him as they moved. He walked with long, measured strides, the muscles in his back shifting beneath his shirt. He had the quiet confidence of a man who had long made peace with solitude. At last, they reached the creek, a narrow thread of silver winding through the canyon. Elias helped her down, guiding her toward the shade of a mesquite tree. "Drink slow," he said, handing her his canteen. The water was warm, but life itself. She drank, and for the first time since morning, her heartbeat steadied. Elias built a small fire and set a pot to boil. "I've got beans and jerky. It ain't much, but it'll fill you." Clara wanted to protest, to insist she could help, but exhaustion pinned her to the ground. She sat silently, watching him move. Every motion was deliberate, efficient. The firelight caught the scar on his forearm, a pale, jagged reminder of the kind of life he'd lived. When he finally handed her a tin plate, their fingers brushed. The contact sent an unexpected warmth spiraling through her. She focused on her food, pretending not to notice the way his eyes lingered. After a while, she spoke softly. "You live out here alone?" Elias nodded. "Got a cabin north of here. Used to be a ranch before my family passed. Been on my own 6 years now." "That must be lonely." He gave a faint smile. "Better lonely than dangerous company." Clara looked up from her plate. "You think I'm dangerous company?" His gaze held hers, gray and steady. "No, ma'am. I think you're brave company. Foolish, maybe, coming all this way alone. But brave." A silence settled between them, not empty, just full of things neither dared to say. As the fire crackled, the desert night grew cold. Elias stood and fetched a wool blanket from his pack. "Here," he said, wrapping it around her shoulders. His hand lingered for a moment, adjusting the edge, and Clara felt the heat of his touch through the rough fabric. "Thank you," she whispered. He stepped back quickly, as if afraid the contact had crossed some unseen line. "You should rest. I'll keep watch." "You don't sleep?" "Not when there's someone to protect." The words struck her harder than she expected. It had been years since anyone had spoken to her like that, with quiet conviction instead of pity. Clara lay down beside the fire, the blanket smelling faintly of smoke and pine. Elias sat a few paces away, sharpening his knife by the firelight, his face a mask of concentration. The flames threw shadows across his jaw, catching the glint in his eyes every time he glanced her way. "Good night, Mr. Ward," she said softly. He looked up. "Good night, Miss Weston. Sleep safe. You've got my word." And somehow, despite everything, the strangers, the silence, the vast desert night, she believed him. For the first time since her father's death, she felt safe enough to close her eyes. As the stars spilled across the black sky, Elias stayed awake, keeping watch over the woman fate had dropped at his feet. He didn't know her story yet, but something about her, her stubbornness, her trembling courage, made him feel a stirring he hadn't felt in years. He had sworn he'd never let another soul close enough to need him again. But as he listened to her slow, steady breathing, he knew it was already too late. Before we continue, comment where in the world you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us. Sometimes salvation rides in from the horizon when you least expect it. The fire had long burned down to embers when the coyotes began to sing. Clara stirred beneath the wool blanket, disoriented for a moment by the strange rhythm of the desert night. She turned her head and saw Elias still awake, seated by the fire's faint glow, his rifle across his knees. His eyes, half shadowed beneath the brim of his hat, flicked toward her as she moved. "You can rest easy," he said quietly. "They're far off. You don't sleep much, do you?" Elias gave a small shrug. "Sleep's a habit a man loses when he's learned what kind of things move after dark." Clara watched him, the silhouette of his massive frame against the dying fire. There was a weariness in him that went beyond exhaustion, something older, etched deep. When she finally closed her eyes again, she heard him murmur something she couldn't quite catch. It sounded like a prayer. By dawn, they were already on the move. The air was sharp and cool, the sun still low behind the mountains. Clara rode in silence, her fingers gripping the saddle horn, as Elias led the horse up a rocky trail that wound toward higher ground. He stopped often to scan the horizon. "Bandits ride these routes," he said. "They see a woman alone, they don't ask questions first. You make it sound like the whole desert's waiting to kill me." "It is," he said without humor, "but don't take it personal. It tries to kill everyone. Despite the grimness of his words, Clara felt oddly calm in his presence. His voice, low and steady, carried something she hadn't felt since childhood: security. By midday, the sun had turned merciless again. They stopped near a stand of mesquite trees, where a trickle of water cut through the red rock. Elias tethered the horse and crouched by the stream to refill the canteens. Clara sat nearby, removing her gloves and dipping her hands into the cool water. The silence between them was companionable now. "Elias," she said after a while, "you said you had a family once. What happened to them?" He didn't look up right away. When he did, his eyes were unreadable. "The fever," he said simply. "Took my mother first, then my brothers. My pa held out the longest. I buried them all up in Ward Canyon. Been just me since." "I'm sorry," he nodded. "Happened a long time ago. Still feels like yesterday sometimes." The conversation might have ended there, but Clara's curiosity wouldn't rest. "You said people call you dangerous. Why?" Elias gave a dry laugh. "Because I am." He looked at her directly then, and she saw it, the shadow behind his calm exterior. "I worked a spell as a tracker for the territorial marshals. They paid me to find men who didn't want to be found. Some of those men didn't make it back alive." Clara's stomach tightened. "You mean you killed them?" "I mean, I did what had to be done." He didn't flinch from her gaze. "I've never killed a man who didn't have it coming." She studied him for a long moment, the tension between fear and understanding twisting inside her. "Then you're not dangerous," she said softly. "You're just honest about what it takes to survive." Elias looked away first, his jaw tightening. "You talk like someone who's seen more than she lets on." Clara smiled faintly. "I was raised in parlors and drawing rooms, but that doesn't mean I was blind. I've seen greed ruin good men and respectability hide monsters. I trust what I can see, not what I'm told." For the first time, she saw something flicker in his expression. Respect. They rode on through the afternoon, climbing into higher country where the wind carried a faint chill. Elias spoke little, but his presence was grounding. When the terrain turned rough, he reached up once to steady her, his massive hand closing over her boot. The touch was brief, but it sent a strange thrill through her, a pulse of something unnamed. As the day faded, the sky flared orange over the canyon rim. Elias slowed the horse and pointed toward a line of smoke in the distance. "Red Hollow," he said. "About half a day's ride come morning." Clara's heart lifted. "So soon?" He nodded. "You'll have a roof and walls again before tomorrow night." The words should have brought relief, but they didn't. The thought of parting made her chest ache unexpectedly. That night, as they made camp beneath a cluster of cottonwoods, she watched him build the fire. His movements were precise, methodical, even gentle for a man his size. When the flames caught, she saw how the light carved deep lines into his face. Not all of them were from age. Some were from pain. He handed her a tin cup of coffee. "Best I can do for now." "It's perfect," she said, though it was bitter enough to sting her tongue. He smirked faintly. "You're polite, too polite for this country. Or maybe you've just forgotten what manners sound like." That made him laugh, a deep, quiet sound that startled them both. For a while they sat in easy silence, the fire snapping between them. Then Elias spoke. "You said you came out here to teach. Why?" Clara hesitated. "Because I needed to become someone new. Back home, a woman alone is treated like a cautionary tale. Out here, I thought maybe I could be useful." Elias studied her, his eyes softening. "You've got more grit than you think." "Maybe you've got more gentleness than you admit," she countered. He looked away, hiding the faint smile tugging at his mouth. "Careful, Miss Weston. You'll make a dangerous woman out of yourself, talking like that." "And what's so dangerous about speaking the truth? It makes men like me forget where the lines are." Clara's breath caught at the way he said it, low, deliberate, his voice rough as the desert wind. For a moment, the fire between them felt like the only thing keeping them from closing the distance. She turned away quickly, staring into the flames. "Then it's a good thing I'm not afraid of lines," she murmured. Elias's voice came softer now. "You should be." Neither of them spoke again. The night filled the space between their unsaid words. The next morning dawned cold and gray. They broke camp early, the horse moving slow along the canyon trail. Clara felt a heaviness settle in her chest the closer they came to Red Hollow. She told herself it was exhaustion, but deep down, she knew it was something else. When the small town finally appeared in the valley below, a cluster of buildings surrounded by red dust, Clara's relief was tempered by a pang she couldn't name. Elias stopped at the ridge, staring down at it. "Your new life," he said quietly. "And yours?" He shrugged. "Mine's back in the mountains. Always has been." They descended, in silence. The streets of Red Hollow were narrow and half empty. The few townsfolk who passed, giving curious glances toward the giant leading a stranger's horse. A boy stared openly before darting off. Elias stopped outside a small whitewashed building. "The schoolhouse," he said. "Looks like they're expecting you." Clara followed his gaze. A sign above the door read, "Red Hollow School, Est, 1891. The year felt unreal to her, like time had folded since she left Philadelphia. "Thank you," she said finally, "for saving my life." Elias nodded once. "No need to thank me. I just happened by." "That's not true," she said. "You could have ridden on." He looked at her for a long moment, his gray eyes unreadable. "Maybe I was meant to stop." She wanted to say something, anything to keep him from turning away, but the words tangled in her throat. He tipped his hat and turned toward his horse. "Wait," she said quickly. "Will I see you again?" Elias paused. "Not unless you're foolish enough to wander into the desert again." It was meant as a joke, but neither of them laughed. He mounted his horse, the muscles in his arms flexing as he pulled himself up. For a heartbeat, Clara thought he might say something more, but he only looked down at her and said, "Take care, Miss Weston." And then he was gone, riding back toward the horizon, swallowed by the heat and the distance. Clara stood there until he was nothing but a dot against the endless sky. Inside the schoolhouse, the headmistress greeted her warmly, but Clara barely heard the words. The classroom smelled of chalk and pine. The window looked west toward the canyon. Somewhere out there, Elias Ward was vanishing back into solitude. That night, as she lay on her narrow bed above the schoolroom, Clara listened to the wind move through the empty streets and wondered if he was sleeping under the same stars. She pressed her fingers to her lips, still remembering the rough gentleness of his hands when he'd helped her down from the horse, and whispered into the dark, "Thank you, Elias Ward, for finding me." The desert didn't answer, but the wind outside carried a low, distant rumble, almost like a voice saying, "You're not forgotten." Before you sleep tonight, ask yourself this. Have you ever met someone who changed your life in one unexpected moment? If so, tell me in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. 2 weeks passed before Clara heard his name again. By then, she had settled into her new life in Red Hollow, or at least pretended to. The small town had welcomed her politely but warily, whispering about the Eastern lady who'd arrived alone. She taught the children of ranchers and miners, her days filled with arithmetic, spelling lessons, and the steady scrape of chalk. At night, though, when the world went quiet, she couldn't silence the memory of gray eyes watching her by firelight. She'd almost convinced herself. She'd imagined him, that Elias Ward had been some fever-born guardian of the desert, when a stranger rode into town one evening and shattered the illusion. Clara was locking the schoolhouse door when she heard the commotion near the saloon. Voices rose, harsh, angry. A gunshot split the evening air, scattering the townsfolk like startled birds. She turned and saw a man stumble into the street, clutching his shoulder. Behind him came another, tall, scarred, eyes cold as metal. "Tell your boss," the scarred man barked. "If he wants the land, he'll have to take it from my hands." The wounded man spat blood. "You're a dead man, Ward." The name hit Clara like a blow. Elias. Before she could think, she was running. Down the dusty street, past shocked faces and open doors. The scarred man turned, his expression hardening as he recognized her. "Clara," he said quietly. "Elias," she breathed. "What are you doing here?" He looked different, rougher, leaner, his shirt torn and streaked with blood. Yet his presence filled the street the same way it had filled the desert. "Trouble found me," he said. "Same men who robbed you. They work for a rancher named Cormac Dane. Been running settlers off their land. I've been tracking them since last spring. You're hurt. It's nothing." But when he swayed, she moved to steady him, ignoring the eyes watching from every doorway. "Come with me," she said firmly. "Now!" She led him behind the schoolhouse, into her tiny quarters above the classroom. Elias barely fit through the narrow doorway. The lamplight caught the exhaustion in his face. "You shouldn't have brought me here," he muttered. "If Dane's men saw me, they'll come looking." "Then let them," Clara snapped. "You saved me once. Let me return the favor." He tried to protest again, but she was already tearing strips from a bedsheet to bind his wound. When her fingers brushed his skin, he flinched, not from pain, but from something else. "You don't owe me this," he said quietly. She met his eyes. "Maybe not, but I want to." Their gazes held. For a long, trembling heartbeat, neither moved. Then Elias looked away first. "You should know," he said roughly. "I didn't just track those men. I killed 2 of them. They'd burned a family's cabin north of the ridge." "Then you did what justice refused to do," Clara said simply. "I'm not afraid of the truth." He studied her face as if trying to understand how anyone could speak with such calm in the face of darkness. "You really aren't, are you?" "I was afraid my whole life," she said, "until the day the desert forced me to choose courage." Elias gave a low laugh, one without humor. "You talk like someone who believes in redemption." "I believe everyone deserves a chance at it," Clara said softly, "even men who think they don't." Outside, the night wind picked up, carrying with it the echo of distant hooves. Elias straightened. "They've found me." He crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbing his rifle. "Stay inside, no matter what you hear. You can't face them alone. I've done worse." "Elias, please," she said, stepping into his path. Her hand caught his arm. "If you walk out that door, they'll kill you." He looked down at her, small, determined, fire in her eyes. "Then let them try," he said, and pushed past her. The gunfire began before he reached the street. Clara ducked behind the window, heart pounding. She saw 3 men on horseback, rifles drawn, shouting over each other. Elias moved through the gun smoke like a phantom, precise and unflinching. 2 went down fast. The 3rd turned and fired wildly, the shot grazing Elias's shoulder. He staggered, but didn't fall. Then the last man was gone, spurring his horse into the darkness. Clara ran out, skirts gathering dust, just as Elias sank to one knee. She dropped beside him, pressing her hands over the bleeding wound. "Fool," she whispered fiercely. "You'll get yourself killed before anyone can thank you properly." He gave a breathless laugh. "You sound like a wife scolding her husband." Her throat tightened. "Maybe I sound like someone who doesn't want to lose you." The words hung between them, impossible to recall once spoken. When she helped him inside again, the silence between them was different now, heavier, alive with all that had been said and all that couldn't be unsaid. She cleaned his wound in quiet concentration, aware of his gaze following every movement. When she finished, Elias spoke. "You should leave this town." "And go where?" "Anywhere safer than here. Dane won't forgive this." "Then I'll stay until he does," she said simply. Elias stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You're braver than half the men I've known," she smiled faintly. "You just realize that?" He reached out, his hand finding hers, large, scarred, impossibly gentle. "You deserve peace, Clara, not a man like me." "Maybe peace looks different for everyone," she whispered. "Maybe mine looks like you." For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, without thinking, she leaned in and pressed her lips softly to his cheek. It was brief, a whisper more than a kiss, but it felt like the closing of some old wound. Elias exhaled shakily. "You shouldn't do that." "Why not?" "Because if you do it again, I won't stop you." She looked at him then, truly looked, at the man who'd saved her, fought for her, and now bled for her, and said quietly, "Then don't." When their lips met this time, it wasn't desperate or forbidden. It was slow, full of all the things they hadn't said. The firelight flickered against the wall, and for a heartbeat, the world outside disappeared. Days passed. Elias healed slowly, though. The wound left him pale. He spent his recovery helping Clara repair the broken shutters and mend the fence behind the schoolhouse. The townsfolk watched them cautiously at first, but when word spread that it was Elias Ward who'd driven off Cormac Dane's men, suspicion turned to respect. For the first time, Clara saw him smile without restraint, a quiet, almost shy thing that changed his whole face. One evening, as they sat on the porch steps, Clara broke the silence. "You could stay, you know. The children would listen to you better than they do to me." He shook his head. "I've never been good at staying. The land's in my blood. I start to itch if I sit still too long." "Then let me come with you." Elias turned sharply. "You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying," she replied. "You think the desert is meant only for men with scars and stories, but maybe it's meant for women who've learned how to survive them." He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "You'd give up a safe life for me?" She smiled. Safe was never living. It was waiting. Elias's breath left him in a slow exhale. "You realize, if you come with me, there's no turning back?" "I already turned back once," she said. "It led me to you." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small and weathered, a silver locket tarnished by time. "My mother's," he said. "She told me to give it to the woman who'd see past my size. I buried it with her years ago, but I took it back before leaving Ward Canyon. Guess I must have known." Clara took it carefully, her fingers brushing his. Inside was a tiny dried wildflower. She looked up at him, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Then I'll keep it safe," she said softly. Elias rose, towering against the fading light. "The train leaves for Tucson at sunrise. We can ride as far as the canyon together. After that, it's a hard trail." "Hard trails never scared me," she said. He smiled then, a slow, deliberate smile that carried both warning and promise. "You'll fit just fine beside me." The dawn that followed painted the world in gold and rose. The town of Red Hollow stirred awake to find the schoolteacher gone, her chalkboard wiped clean, her room empty but for a folded note, "Thank you for the kindness. Teach the children courage. I've gone to find my own." Out beyond the ridge, two riders moved west, their shadows stretching long against the sand. Clara rode close beside Elias, her hands steady on the reins, her eyes bright with quiet certainty. "Where are we headed?" she asked. "Wherever the road don't end," he said. She laughed softly. "That sounds like forever." Elias looked down at her. "It just might be." They rode on until the town disappeared behind them, swallowed by the shimmering horizon. Ahead, the desert opened wide and wild, full of danger and beauty and every kind of possibility. Clara Weston, the woman who once feared the world beyond her gates, had found her freedom not in safety, but in choosing the impossible, in loving a man the world called dangerous. And Elias Ward, the giant who'd once chosen solitude, had found redemption not in silence, but in being seen. As the sun climbed higher, he reached across and took her hand, their fingers fitting together as easily as if they'd been meant to all along. "Whatever comes next," he said quietly, "we face it together." "Always," Clara said, and the desert wind seemed to answer, carrying their laughter into the endless sky. Before we ride into the next story, tell me this. Do you believe love can find you in the unlikeliest places? Comment where you're watching from. Share this story if it touched you. And don't forget to subscribe, because every week we tell stories that remind us, even in the harshest deserts, love still blooms.